Hi, everyone. We're back. We're going to start our next panel on causes and effects of solitary, and to take us through the session of discussion. We have some really super speakers, and our moderator is the famous Caddy Gray. Caddy Gray, the curtain is on. Oh, I don't see her. Let me just make sure she's there. Yeah. There she is. Hello, Caddy.
Hi, I'm sorry about that, y'all. Steve, I don't know why I thought you were moderating this panel, but yes, I'm on.
No, you're
hello.
on the agenda.
Hello, Kate, Jason, and Vidal. I'm excited to hear what y'all have to say. Journalists, the extended bios are in the program. I'll be a straight no chaser moderator. We'll go in alphabetical order. This discussion, I think, is largely linked to yesterday's discussion on health effects, body and brain, and in this instance, the disproportionality of the kinds of people who end up in solitary. So Kate, if you would give us the start, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. So my name is Kate Bryan. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you all today. I am a policy analyst with the National Conference of State Legislatures. And for those who might be unfamiliar with NCSL, we are a nonprofit bipartisan organization. And our members include legislators as well as legislative staff in all 50 states, DC and the US territories. And kind of one of our primary goals is to provide legislative as well as policy research at both the state and federal level. And one of my particular areas of focus is juvenile justice. So to start today's conversation, I think it's worthwhile to kind of look from a very high level, take a look at the landscape nationally as it relates to solitary confinement and its use in juvenile justice. So if we look back to 2018, we see two relevant pieces of federal legislation. One, the First Step Act, and this is a bipartisan bill that was passed by Congress that prohibits juveniles who are in federal custody from being placed in solitary confinement unless that individual poses a physical risk to others in the environment and if other de-escalation techniques have proven unsuccessful. Now, the second piece of legislation is actually a reauthorization, and the reauthorization applies to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. And within this reauthorization, there are two provisions that apply to states. The first, mandating states that states adhere to certain reporting requirements as it relates to their use of solitary confinement in juvenile justice detention centers. The second provides that states must provide information as to what they are doing, that is to say, what strategies they are using to reduce the use of isolation in its juvenile detention centers. Now, looking at 2019, so a year after these federal mandates went through, we actually see that there was a fair amount of legislative momentum at the state level. Bills were being passed that codified limitations on the use of solitary confinement for juveniles. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but some examples are New Jersey, Arkansas, New Mexico. They place limitations stating explicitly in statute age ranges. So in New Jersey, for instance, anyone under the age of 21 cannot be placed in solitary confinement. In Arkansas and New Mexico, the age is 18. New Mexico also codified certain reporting requirements that facilities had to adhere to. Now, looking to 2022, we see just under half of the states, including Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, have some sort of law on the books that narrows the application of solitary confinement for juveniles. But like most issues, there are two sides to this debate, and proponents of solitary confinement will argue that this is a tool that can be used to maintain safety, not only safety of staff, but also safety of other youth in the facility, as well as maintain the general security of the facility. Now, those who kind of stand on the other side of the fence on this debate might counter that argument by saying, well, there's research that's come out that shows that reforming the use of solitary confinement and using alternative interventions can actually enhance safety in all three of those realms. So facility, staff, as well as youth who are in these centers. And one of the more commonly cited examples is the Missouri model. Now, the Missouri Division of Youth Services made a switch from using traditional kind of corrections interventions, of course, solitary confinement being one of those, to using more trauma-informed care as well as group therapy-based models. Now, after the implementation of these alternatives, they did publish a report, and this report showed that compared to other states, staff in Missouri facilities were 13 times less likely to be assaulted. Other youth in the facilities were 4.5 times less likely to be assaulted by peers. And the young people who were in these detention centers or residential placement centers were 200 times less likely to be placed in solitary confinement. Now, as more data and research has come to light regarding some of the potential adverse outcomes that can be precipitated by solitary confinement, organizations, one being the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, has taken the position that they do not endorse the use of solitary confinement for young people because it can lead to adverse psychological outcomes such as depression, anxiety, in some instances psychosis. There have been documented cases in which young people who have been placed in solitary confinement have engaged in self-harming behaviors. There was actually a report published in 2009 that showed of the total number of juveniles who had committed suicide while in confinement, 50% of those young people were actually on some kind of restrictive housing or isolation program. Similarly, the Council for Juvenile Corrections Administrators has also taken the position that in light of this emerging data and other research, that solitary confinement actually undermines the rehabilitative process, which is the ultimate goal for youth in a secure setting. So that was kind of a lot of information in a short period of time. I'm happy to send it over to other panelists or take any questions that you might have.
Kate, thank you so much. I think we're going to go with Jason next and then have Vidal wrap it up, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So Jason, you're on. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, Ketty, and thanks so much for being invited to participate, and good to be with y'all. Not happy to be talking about this topic, but am glad that there is space on the agenda to talk about the use of solitary confinement in youth facilities. I think Kate did a great job of summarizing the key federal developments, which I know I'll share. I'm Jason Szanyi. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for Children's Law and Policy. We're a small nonprofit based in Washington that works on youth justice reform around the country. And since 2016, we have been part of an effort called campaign called Stop Solitary for Kids, which we have been working on in partnership with Georgetown University Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, the Center for Juvenile Justice Administrators, which Kate mentioned, which is kind of the trade association for folks who run youth justice agencies around the country, and the Justice Policy Institute. I'll share a little more about the campaign in just a moment, and some resources that will hopefully be helpful in reporting on this. But I think that Kate, the federal developments, both the First Step Act and the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act with the provisions around solitary were really important. I think they elevated the focus on this issue. But there has been, and there's been lots of action at the state level, which, Kate, I know you mentioned NCSL does such a great job of kind of tracking those efforts. We do our best to try to do that as part of the campaign, and I'll share some of those resources. So there's been a lot of movement and focus on this, and I think we've appreciated that because we have seen firsthand and very personally, the devastating impact that the use of solitary confinement can have on young people. I will say we are working in some jurisdictions that want to try to get out ahead of something happening, and so who come to us proactively to request our help in making conditions better. But more often than not, we are coming into an agency or a facility in the wake of a tragedy, such as the death of a child, a suicide, or some other major incident that has hurt children, and in some situations hurt staff members who are charged with their care. So I would love to get to a point where we're not having to respond to those kind of crises, but unfortunately, we're still in that position. And I think the impact of COVID on youth facilities has been just really significant. And as much as I had hopes for a few years ago, solitary kind of fading away as a practice in youth justice because of staffing shortages and other issues, I think we're seeing a reversion to the use of that practice. And I'm very, very concerned about what that means for the safety and well-being of young people and the staff charged with their care. A couple of things that I'll mention before kicking it over to Vidal. So I know, Kate, you presented both sides in terms of the folks who argue against the use of solitary, and we would put ourselves in that camp, and then the folks who say it's necessary. I really, I think we take issue with there being two sides on this. It's really, this is a really harmful practice. And I think when you have folks like the Council for Juvenile Justice Administrators, which is the trade association for folks who run agencies, saying, we don't believe that this is an acceptable professional practice, then that's where we should be, starting the conversation. One of the things that frustrates me, and I agree that there's a need for more research. We have very poor data on the impact of solitary on kids of color in particular, its disproportionate use with Black and brown youth. But for the folks who say, well, show me the study that says that putting kids in solitary is harmful to them, we shouldn't need a study to show that. It's just, you wouldn't give staff working in youth facilities baseball bats and say that that's okay. And, if there's no study showing that giving them that kind of tool is harmful to kids. So that's just a frustration we've had kind of with the debate. And I think the good thing that we're seeing in youth justice is that more and more agencies are showing that you do not need to rely on not only do you not need to rely on the use of solitary to keep youth and staff safe. As Kate mentioned, you can make the therapeutic mix much better for both the kids and the staff. You can have safer facilities, facilities that actually have a chance of helping a young person re-enter their communities, as opposed to just being a place where kids are re-traumatized and traumatized and harmed. So one of the resources I will put in the chat is a report that we did a few years ago called Not in Isolation. And it profiles 4 jurisdictions' efforts to safely reduce and get close to the elimination of the use of room confinement in a way that really looked at the issue as a holistic one. And one of the reasons we have a whole campaign focused on solitary confinement, it is a very dangerous and harmful practice. It is wildly overused in this country. But it's also a signal for us, and this is based on years and years of experience. If solitary confinement is being used in a youth facility, that's a symptom that there are other issues at play. Staff may not be trained to the degree that they need to be to interact with kids. Kids may not have access to the programming that is needed to engage them and help them develop skills, and the behavioral health services may be lacking. And so the response oftentimes is that the easiest thing to do is put a kid behind his or her door, behind their door, and just ignore the problem. So we've seen the overuse of room confinement as an entry point to have broader conversations about kind of how the facility is operating more generally. And I think if you look at investigations that the Department of Justice has done into youth facilities over problematic conditions, if you look at investigations that have been done by state child advocates, such as in Connecticut, you'll see that the use of isolation is one problematic practice, but it's occurring in this broader constellation of other concerns that really do need to be addressed. So I think we are seeing progress. We have more and more working examples of places that may not be perfect, but that really have worked to eliminate this as a tool that they use to respond to different kinds of incidents. And I will put in the chat kind of the position statement that we have at Stop Solitary for Kids that outlines what we consider to be solitary and when it's acceptable and when it's not. It is, in our view, acceptable if a kid is actively acting out and, throwing punches or assaulting folks to separate that young person. And if that means putting them in their room, then that can be acceptable, but only until that young person has de-escalated their behavior, and there should be active efforts working to de-escalate the behavior of that young person. So we're not saying that it can never be used, but the way that it is currently used in many jurisdictions is deeply, deeply problematic. And 2 other things I'll just want to point out. There are more and more states that have laws on the books that look good, or pretty good, I will say, in terms of their what they're saying about reducing the use of solitary. The issue is in the implementation, and we have seen many states and facilities skirt implementation of what the letter of the law seems to require by calling the use of solitary something different, by not really tracking data when kids are in their rooms. So that can be really tough. I know one question that came in during the previous panel was what kind of information to request to assess where a facility or an agency is at on the use of solitary. And we are working on that, but I will share a recent investigation that the Office of the Child Advocate did in Connecticut, where they outline the information they requested when they did their investigation. And it's a pretty solid list. It's what we would ask for if we were coming in to look at a facility. So I'll put that in the chat and include a page number. But I will say one of the things that I'm hoping reporters like all y'all will look to is where are jurisdictions actually at with implementation, because I think unfortunately a lot of places are falling short or are going to fall short. And then the other issue I would just want to lift up is to please be careful about the language you use when reporting about young people and youth justice. I know that there are editorial guidelines. I'm not happy with my local paper, The Post, in that they use the term juvenile when talking about young people in the justice system. But to the extent that we can start pushing back on that, I know that at 3 o'clock, I'm not going to pick my juveniles up from school. I'm going to pick my kids up from school. So language matters, and hopefully y'all can be part of our effort to try to have a more honest narrative about young people and their involvement with the system. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Jason, thank you so much. Vidal, you're on. I'm excited to hear your story about your personal experience and also the sort of remedies that we're going to talk about and get into in the Q&A. So you're on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, not just before I even talk about my story, I've been a very active activist in this space. So one thing about it is my name is Vidal Guzman, pronoun he, him. I am one of the founders of the End Qualified Immunity campaign in New York City that now is probably working with Ben & Jerry's. And also I am one of the founders of the Fix the 13th NY campaign that is making sure people are not coerced and forced against their labor. And that does exist because of the slavery clause of the 13th Amendment. And I am a launching member of the Close Rikers Island campaign in New York. So I was a very vocal and active member. But I think everyone knows I am a survivor of solitary confinement. You know, I was someone who was in solitary confinement at a very early age. I think 19 years old is still early. The brain hasn't fully developed to 25. But I think I also have to say before I start this, you know, New York has 33 people who have died in Rikers Island. And I have to say people like Elijah Muhammad, who died in solitary confinement and spent more than 32 hours in isolation, basically violating the department rules. Why isolation? The person didn't have a bed or access to medical care. And in New York City, what's happening right now is that majority of our states facilities are violating HALT Solitary Act. And that is something that I have to start with, and that's something that reporters should know about. But for me, I think for me, experiencing the solitary confinement space, you know, I never even knew solitary confinement even existed. You know, like I think that has to be truthful. Like I never knew that a place that is isolation that you can't even speak at. You know, my first time going in solitary confinement, I was actually in a New York facility, and I was actually next to the rapper Ja Rule. And Ja Rule was actually going upstate, and he was sentenced, and he was in the same chair as myself. So I remember they had to have him anytime celebrities are going upstate, they usually, sometimes they even put them through solitary confinement. So there is that method that's being used anywhere when any type of celebrity or someone high profile is going and getting incarcerated. But for me, like, you know, my first time being in solitary confinement, I didn't even know you cannot talk in solitary confinement. And I learned the hard way, right? Like you know, sometimes you try to have a conversation with someone who's right next to you and they like, shh, don't say nothing. Because if they keep hearing you speak, correctional officers are going to come in your cell and beat you up. And I laughed, and to a certain point when I laughed, like, that's not going to happen. And it did happen. You know, this is something that for them it is a way to have control and power. But for me, experiencing that, I came out losing 10, 15 pounds, and I only spent 28 days in solitary confinement. That my first time being in there. And I think that was like starvation, the abilities of them giving me my food, or not giving me my food, you know, and that's things that happen, right? But I also spent years in solitary confinement when I was incarcerated 19 till I was 24. And one time I was even in hunger strike because, and realistically, like I had an injury that happened to my finger after defending myself in a situation when I was upstate. And, you know, I kept asking for the captain to come in. Yo, I need medical attention. I need medical attention. And, you know, the captain wouldn't even come, or any medical attention wouldn't even come where I was at in the cell. And then I started really talking to, because at that time I was also a high ranking member of the Bloods. And, you know, I think this is a conversation we need to have on the national level, and I'm gonna get to it. So I started having conversation with people around the chair. That's what we call, you know, the area where people are in solitary confinement. So I was talking to people who was in Muslims, people who was Bloods, Crips, Lion Kings, and I started finding out that some of them even had people, they wasn't even getting access to medical care. And for me hearing that, you know, the first thing that we started thinking about is like, okay, we have differences, but we have an issue right now, and our life is being put in jeopardy. So what we did was the best thing to do with the circumstances that we had. So we did hunger strikes. You know, a hunger strike for a lot of reporters, they might not like the tactic, but that's the only tactic incarcerated people have, right? The abilities to, you know, not eat, the abilities to flood the, you know, the chair. That's the area where the correctional officers walk by to bring attention, or not, you know, really causing a loud effect throughout the solitary confinement area, banging on doors and not letting any correctional officer have a regular day, because we felt that we had serious injuries that needed medical access that we did not get. So, you know, that was really my first time actually being in that situation and having to organize. So for me, like, being experienced and being exposed to solitary confinement was a very early on. But I spent, as I said before, 19 till I was 24, you know, basically in there, you know. And for me, like, here a couple years ago in New York, you know, after they ended solitary confinement for youth, they started sending youth to upstate facilities to keep them in solitary confinement. So we seen tactics like this being done. And then, you know, yesterday, you know, whole solitary has passed in New York, but right now, there is that there is a ongoing fight, and we have 33 people that died in New York City's Rikers Island, is a 9-8 jail complex. And for us, we knew that we had to do something. So our public advocate actually, you know, established a New York City Council bill, Intro 549, that would end solitary confinement. And for us, you know, like, this is a very important issue, because solitary confinement shouldn't exist anywhere. But what does that actually mean? What does it mean after solitary confinement is really over, right? Like, we got to ask ourselves a very hard question, right? What do we do with gang members, right? Gang culture people, because this is what the Department of Correction and people who are saying, oh, what are we going to do with these people? And one of the things that I say is, like, Halt Solitary has really understand what it means to really give people program access, to really push states to start thinking about different ways of how programs really work in solitary. And I'm gonna name, like, our RSVP program in San Francisco jail has been very successful. CAT program in New York City are example of ways that we don't have to use solitary confinement. And for me, even someone who was a former gang member and is a very active community member, one of the programs that helped me out was AVP, Alternative to Violent Programs. And I'm gonna say this name because a lot of people know who this person is. You know, individuals like, you know, in like the think tank from Greenhaven, there was the first individuals who established the AVP program. The AVP program was done after the riots that happened in Attica. And basically this program really teach people basic skills. Like, I think when people ask themselves, why does violence exist, is that we're doing the work wrong. In New York City jails, they actually expanded cure violence and credible messengers to actually be in these facilities to talk to people and talk to high risk detainees and ask them, what is your needs? What do you want to see? How do you want to return back to society? And also see people who was gang members or still active. And the AVP program really taught me, and it taught a lot of directly impacted people how to manage strong feelings such as anger and fear. That is the most, these are the most fears that anyone incarcerated deal with, anger and fear. Deal with more effective way of risk and danger, right? Build good relations with other people. You know, build on skills and learn new skills. understand why conflicts happens, right? I think I live in a neighborhood that have been underfunded, over incarcerated with police. We are, our way and the way that we grew up, especially being in violent cultures, violent communities. And the reason why I say that, because of all this poverty that happens, a lot of times people don't know how to deal with conflicts. They deal with conflicts by using violence as a defense mechanism. And that is a real issue that we have to start cutting down. And the most important thing, especially in jail, how do we transfer a situation from aggressiveness to actually sitting down and having conversations? And that's what AVP taught me. AVP, when I was up there in these programs, we had many different gang members. I was in Green Correctional Facility that it was a youth facility. 45 out of the 60 individual youth who was there had some type of gang culture or was a part of some type of gang culture. And one of the things that AVP really helped to get all these individuals in the same space, but it helped people to understand, like, we have to start thinking different than what we are moving, how we're operating. But I wanted to kind of end this and say, like, we have to start having serious conversation and reevaluating the programs that are in these facilities. Are these programs working? Because one of the things that I hear from correctional officers all the time is that if we end solitary, what is next? And we have to provide the groundwork for that. Because if we're not, we're going to keep pushing out these reports and saying this is what we need to do, report until we actually create really established programs and really reevaluate what programs are not working in these facilities, what programs are working, because this is the way for us to start pushing these conversations and say, hey, violence has decreased in the facility. Let's keep thinking about other programs. And I say one of the most important things, and this happens all the time, there is a problem when we don't get directly impacted people, not talking about people who are returning back from society, from being impacted by the system, but people who are inside. How do we actually get you to tell us what programs are better suited to you? If we're talking about how Norway and Germany is operating with a residual rate of 20%, their conversation is that they start their conversation of what do you need when you come in? So, for juvenile, it's no ifs and buts. We have to end that. It don't matter what happens or how do we separate someone. We have to have therapy, especially with individuals who are young like this. I'm someone who is still in therapy because of my experience with the, not just with the criminal justice system, police brutality, but solitary confinement, so I think there has to be a very important part of how do we prepare people when they come in? How do we prepare people when they come out? Because one of the things that we notice, and this is something that I have to say two things. There's millions and hundreds of people who are released directly from solitary to the outside community. And that means in New York, and that happens in a lot of different places. So that means this individual didn't receive no education, no rehabilitation programs, and no services to help them prepare to return back to society.
Vidal, I'm gonna let you save that second one for I think part of the Q&A is going to give us room to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. As you are citing these places that work, you, Jason, and Kate, specifically, what is the construct that makes, if it's a trauma-informed work, what's the dot and tittle of that work? What is the construct? How is it set up? Who are the clinicians that are there? Who are the peer supports? Jason, if you would jump in and start breaking that down and name, so if there are places that you believe model that, name that so the journalists can sort of go there.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I just put a bunch of links in the chat. I think that Vidal shared a bunch of really great programs. We're hesitant to point to any particular agency because there can be backsliding, there can be, we're not on the ground in these places, but one of the jurisdictions we featured in our Not in Isolation report was the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services, which after pretty much back-to-back youth suicides in their facilities really shifted away from the use of solitary. they use an approach, an overarching approach with young people called dialectical behavioral therapy. It's not the only intervention that they employ, but they really actively use that model to try to work and train staff to be able to use that model, not just the clinicians, but the direct care staff to be able to work with young people to try to work through conflict and have better responses when they're encountering challenges. So I would encourage folks to take a look. You can take a look at the profile of Massachusetts DYS. Oregon Youth Authority has also worked really hard to bring in a wide array of programming into their facilities. They hold youth, I believe, up to the age of 25.
So when you say wide array, what is that? And so the clinicians would be the social workers, the psychiatrists, but when you talk about direct care workers, who do you mean?
So direct care workers. So in terms of Massachusetts, I'm talking about the folks who folks would probably label juvenile correctional officers. They're called youth development specialists here in DC. But those are the folks who are spending hours and hours and hours with the kids. Obviously, you want a really robust educational program. I really appreciated Vidal's point about bringing folks in who have lived experience to work with young people. That's one thing. Here in DC, folks, the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services here in DC really has embraced credible messengers as a core component of how they work with young people. And those folks are in the secure facilities. They're not just there to meet the kids after they're released. They're working with them while they're inside. And that's a benefit to the kids. It's a benefit to the staff because they don't have to shoulder everything that has to get worked through. So I would love to see more things like that happening in places across the country.
Just a question before we move to Kate. Those credible messengers with lived experience, formerly incarcerated people, are they paid? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
They have to be. They have to be. They are doing work that is as important or more important than anybody else working in those institutions or running those institutions.
Okay. Kate, if you want to jump in there, if y'all have an idea of what this model of best practices that is building, what are those practices?
I honestly don't feel like, I can really speak to that because it's a little bit outside of my expertise, but to kind of piggyback on what Jason said, the kind of emerging body of research that is coming out with respect to facilities that have tried transitioning again from some of the more, traditional, responses in, kind of the corrections and detention setting to using more of these trauma-informed care models has shown some promise and efficacy. And to Jason's point, yes, I've certainly come across the credible messengers as one method, as well as there are some jurisdictions where when a young person does enter a facility, they might get kind of paired up with a mentor that can kind of help with that transition. So those are just some of the elements that we have come across kind of with respect to changing from traditional to some alternative interventions.
Thank you. Jason, I want to ask you one quick question. You mentioned upstate facilities, and as someone who is a New Yorker, were these upstate juvenile? You told me I don't say that, but that's, yeah, right. We can talk about language in a minute. Were they adult prisons or were they juvenile facilities? When you were talking about kids who were sent upstate. So that's a first question. The second question, you mentioned the San Francisco project and the CAP project in New York City. To your mind, why do they work? And what aspects of that did not exist when you were incarcerated?
Is that a question for me or?
It's for you, Vidal, yes.
Oh. I think this is just studies from Halt Solitary. These are advocates who have been doing this work for 10 years. Like I've been upstate when AVP was, up there. I was a facilitator for it. but also these been programs that have been working, like this is studies that people been looking around the country and saying these programs are successful. How
So
do we?
why do they work? What do they look like? What did you see that these young people are getting that you did not get?
Well, I can talk more on the AVP, but I'll let people know, please look up RSVP program, San Francisco, and CAP program in New York City. I'll talk about the AVP program. I think for me, like it helped out in a very important way, because it helped me to understand what I was going through and how to have conversation. A lot of times when violence happens, especially what lands people into solitary confinement, is a lot of the things could have been talked about. Right. And that is a very important issue that AVP taught me, and also taught me how to care about yourself and how to have, how to communicate in difficult situations. Right. Because a lot of times when I, as myself or seeing violence, sometimes it might be a miscommunication that might lead someone to landing in solitary confinement. It's so many little ifs and buts of things that happen that land in people in solitary confinement. But for me, the AVP program was a very successful way for me to not just leave the gang culture, but it also helped me to understand that I had abilities to be someone, to facilitate, to educate, and I think that is one of the things when programs do that, when they give you the confidence, the push, the power to see yourself in a different light, that is a success, especially for someone like myself that been through a lot of different violence. So I say for me, like the AVP program, and also, like I said before, taking the leadership of Halt Solitary and the advocates who've been in this space for 10 years, I trust them. These are people who have taught me how to return back to society,
What I'm curious, I'm wondering if an adult solitary cell, if you will, is different from juvenile. I mean, what was the chair, as you said, like for you, and how much time did you spend there in a day?
Yeah, so majority, it's a lot different, right? For juveniles, they might have an individual that's just one per cell. But then in different states in New York City, you have double bunk, right? So basically you have 2 person per cell.
And that's solitary, 2-person solitary?
Yes. And it doesn't, and that is done because there's so many people that are put in solitary confinement. But there are, because of that happening, a lot of things does happen, right? Like fights happen, or people not trying to let someone in. Like, I don't know this person. Like, it's so much that happens when you're doing that. But I say, like I seen the horror of putting someone with someone else in a cell. I don't think that is a good thing. I think that the state has been using that and abusing that. But I also say, like, for me, like the chair was a place that's, I was in Green Correctional Facility, and the box was a place that everyone in that area. So, we had youth from Washington, Washington Correctional Facility come into the, Green Box. And we had some adults from different facilities come there. But I'll say to you, like most majority of the people there was young, less, there was under 25. This is a facility that, kids was like 16 years old, doing 7 years, doing 7 years, doing 5 years. And, one of the things I tell people, like when I talk about kids, they look like kids. When you got someone who's, you're 19 years old and you see one who's a kid who's 16 years old, 5'1" and 110 pounds, it's scary, and I seen, some of my friends who are from my neighborhood spent 3 years in solitary confinement. For me, like I spent close to 2 years in solitary confinement, so for me, like I was my whole, time being in solitary confinement, you have to like, I was a survival kit, right? Like you go right into survival mode. You have to figure out how to take a bird bath, right? Because they might not turn a shower for 2-3 days. Because a correctional officer might bring his energy from home or whatever's going on to the facility to his shift. Or sometimes, we a lot of us even don't have anyone who's there with us when we haven't just, when we're going to hear about the ticket that we got. In New York, 95% of people who are charged with rule violation are found guilty, so even myself, I lost my good time, I lost my good time to go home early because someone put a weapon in my cell and it wasn't even mine, right? So imagine me as an individual, I remember this, it was Cinco de Mayo and I was supposed to go home June 3rd. I was so happy. And one of the things I learned, people tell you all the time, don't tell people when you go home. And I learned that the hard way. I woke up, I woke up with a weapon being in my cell, and I had to answer back and say, hey, this is not mine. And I had to do another 6 months. And lost my good time, so I think for me, like that there's some horror to my experience of in solitary confinement.
Thank you, Jason. We have about 4 minutes left. I want to run quickly through a few questions. What is what percentage of kids, as best can be determined with this incomplete research, what percentage of kids end up in solitary? And is there an average amount of time that they're there? Jason?
I can't even, I wouldn't feel comfortable giving a response, but even based on the data that have been gathered, I think the data are just really poor. I am hopeful that the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention will undertake some new data collection efforts as part of the reauthorization of the JJDPA. And there are some states that
But break down JJDPA. What does that stand for?
Sorry, that's the Federal Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. That's the main federal law that focuses on juvenile justice in this country.
Thank you for that. Kate, maybe this is a question for you. I'm curious as to whether these reforms are driven by concerns about what's humane or concerns about dollars spent or what?
That's kind of a hard question to answer, what might be kind of the motivation behind the reforms. But what I can say is that we are seeing more legislation, as I previously mentioned, being enacted in this space. But again, as to what the rationale is as to why these bills are being brought forth, I don't think I could sit and say with 100% confidence as to why these bills are getting passed through the legislature.
Sure. And if I might ask, as we sort of end, and this is for the three of you, the sort of broad philosophical question, if you will. Jason, you mentioned that overuse of solitary, where it is overused, is often emblematic of broader problems at a facility. And I can't help but go back to the Miami Herald had that award-winning series, The Fight Club, right? How much have things, and for the journalists who are here, if you have not read that, go see it. It's called The Fight Club. Miami Herald is a stunning, stunning piece. How much has changed since then, those sort of underlying problems? And that question is for Kate as well. And perhaps also Vidal, if you could close us out on that answer. What's changed? I mean, or yeah, how swift or not has been the progress?
I think there has definitely been progress in places that have focused on this issue and seen it holistically. I think the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice has done some really great work, and they face staffing challenges and shortages, but they've really made a concerted effort. I do think that COVID really set the field back significantly, and I am very worried. We're seeing more and more articles every day about conditions really deteriorating in youth facilities, to the point where you have 2 staff people responsible for 50 plus kids. I mean, that
50.
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember where that was, but it's not responsible to try to operate a facility like that. Like, if that's the way that the facility is going to be run, then those kids should be released, and we should be finding alternatives. That there's no way you can provide anything close to the minimum of what's required under the Constitution, let alone what those kids are entitled to as part of their rehabilitation.
Kate, if you want to address that, and then Vidal, I'd like to give you the sort of wrap-up word, if you will, please.
Sure, I think I'm going to kind of look at this from a little bit of a different angle, and Jason had kind of mentioned this before, but as we see states codify reforms with respect to solitary confinement and young people, another kind of important element to look at is, as Jason mentioned, what are the provisions or lack thereof related to the data collection and transparency. That is something that, and I think I mentioned this, and if I didn't, I apologize in kind of my opening to the discussion, but there is jurisdictional differences between these collection requirements, as well as kind of the relative accessibility of this information. Just off of top of mind, Colorado, for instance, has codified provisions related to what data must be collected, and while it is publicly available, it's available upon request. So again, it's kind of a spectrum as to what's being collected and how easily accessible this information is.
Vidal, as you answer what's better and what's not, I want to sort of do a composite of a couple of questions here that goes to the issue of coverage and language, and journalists there's some language we cannot get around. It's just part of the craft. What would you prefer you not have been called during the period of your incarceration, and also as a formerly incarcerated person? So if you'd handle those two things, we'll let you have a last word.
Yeah, I think with me, I think language is important. It tells you how much you care about humanity, right? Like one of the things I'll say to people, I hated being called inmate. It's so dehumanizing to hear that. Like, for me hearing that, or ex-felon, or those are one of the things that that one of those noise when you hear is like, please stop. So I really say to people, please learn about the language that we need to use. Eddie Ellis was one of the former Black Panther, and it has always educated us about language, and I will always keep taking his leadership around why it's important for language, because language is humanizing, and that is one step that you can do in this space, and that's a step that's easy to take.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, y'all, for a fabulous panel. We so appreciate it. You are on, the journalist will have your contact information as a part of this, and we appreciate y'all. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, I put there's a question from Clark Merrifield for Vidal to ask him to define clearly what the box is and what the chair is, but I'll leave that for him to write, and he'll send it out perhaps later to our journalists separately, so we won't waste time. And we'll close off this session now and take a 10-minute break. Thank you all.